Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here today. My name is Sarah Mason, and I'm a Senior Policy Associate at the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability here at Duke University. This is the third session of the webinar series, the National Climate Resilience Framework from Ideas to Action. And today's session is going to focus on centering communities, nature, and cross-sector partnerships in resilience and adaptation projects. I do want to let everyone know that today's webinar will be recorded and posted online. And the recording link will be sent to everyone that registered. So if you missed part of this or want to revisit anything, you will get that link. And we should have time for a few audience questions at the end. So please go ahead and enter your questions into the Q&A box as they arise. The goal of this webinar series is to share information and progress related to the National Climate Resilience Framework, which was released in September last year. This is the first ever national resilience framework, and it established a vision for a climate resilient nation, as well as guidance for resilience-related activities and investments by the federal government and its partners. This series brings together experts from government, nonprofit, and private sectors to discuss elements of the framework, as well as how to implement it. If you'd like to hear about future sessions, please sign up for our mailing list, and I'll share a link to sign up for that in just a moment, as well as a link to the National Climate Resilience Framework in the chat. But before I do that, I'm going to introduce today's hosts. The session today is being hosted by the Resilience Roadmap Project, the Climate Adaptation Fund, and the Climate Resilience Fund. The Resilience Roadmap is a project hosted by the Nicholas Institute here at Duke University, focused on making recommendations for how to build greater climate resilience in the United States through federal action. And to introduce the other co-hosting organizations, I'm going to pass off to our moderator, Liz Tully, who is a program officer at the Climate Resilience Fund, where she's continuing much of the grant making and field building work she led while at the Climate Adaptation Fund.
Hi. Let me get my screen shared. I'm Liz Tully. I am a program officer at the Climate Resilience Fund, as Sarah said. And I'll show you my slides in a moment, just to introduce who we are and what we're going to talk about for this session. I'm formerly the director of the Wildlife Conservation Society's Climate Adaptation Fund. It had previously been a partner with the Climate Resilience Fund, where I now work. We've worked on a guide for funders for grant making to climate smart conservation projects. We also were co-hosting a session at the National Adaptation Forum, and the WCS Climate Adaptation Fund is a co-host of this session in the Resilience Roadmaps Project's Ideas to Action webinar series that Sarah just introduced and described about implementing the National Resilience Framework and guiding federal actions to prioritize adaptation along with the mitigation focus and priorities too. So you're going to hear, well, I want to talk about on the slide. There's several logos up here. We have the Stanford Woods Institute and the Duke Nicholas Institute are both partners in the Resilience Roadmap Project, and I wanted to make sure we emphasize those. I really appreciate what the Resilience Roadmap has been doing to bring this framework to more communities, get it out to more practitioners, hear from practitioners like we're going to do today. And then the Climate Smart Communities Initiative is hosted by the Climate Resilience Fund and a series of other partners that I'll get into in the next slide, as well as NOAA. And one of our speakers, Ned Gardiner, is the program officer for the Climate Smart Communities Initiative. We also have Shiloh Halsey on here from the Cascade Forest Conservancy. Shiloh is a Climate Adaptation Fund grant partner. And Alexa Whipple is from the Salmon Recovery Foundation, also a Climate Adaptation Fund grant partner. So you're going to hear, these are representatives from two different national programs that have been focused on implementing adaptation and resilience on the ground through local partnerships. And if you've read through the framework at all yet, you'll see there, I would love to get a word count on the number of times partnerships, locals, or communities is mentioned. I was really thrilled with that. It's throughout all the 6 objectives, an emphasis on cross-sector partnerships, implementing this on the ground through real partners and local leaders. So these are 2 different programs you're hearing from. They're very similar and very different at the same time, but they're both very focused on local ground-up work and getting this done through different partnerships across different sectors. They also both focus on nature. In particular, the Climate Adaptation Fund is only focused on natural resources management and climate adapted conservation. And the Climate Smart Communities Initiative, or CSCI, is focused across multiple sectors in the human and built world, but inclusive of nature and natural systems, but also emphasizes the application of nature-based solutions. Let me know if you see my next slide pop up. So a quick introduction, again, the Climate Smart Communities Initiative, you see the logos down at the bottom. These are all the consortium partners that actually make this new program a reality. I like the CSCI is brand new. It was announced when the National Climate Resilience Framework was announced back in the fall of 2023. And we're launching our pilot year this year and actually reviewing our very first applications for the grant making component. There are many components to the CSCI, but one of them is grant making, similar to the Climate Adaptation Fund, where Shiloh and Alexa are representing. That's a grant making program as well. What CSCI does is supports local leaders and adaptation professionals together in advancing climate resilience plans and projects in communities across the United States. It's really all about leveraging that community leadership that's already there and the knowledge that's there to equip community leaders to identify problems, climate change problems themselves, and identify and implement solutions themselves in partnership with a trained climate resilience practitioner. And then a quick introduction, my little advancement works, to the Climate Adaptation Fund, an overview. This is just a huge portfolio of on-the-ground projects, 140 projects across 48 states, Commonwealths, U.S. territories, and tribal nations. Some of them are, we call them JMA, you'll see there, or joint mitigation adaptation projects. There's examples in 17 different ecosystem types, several tribal partnered or tribal led projects, urban adaptation projects. And the portfolio can be categorized by how many projects work with the local government or a state government or a federal agency or a state agency. If you want to understand just from like a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service perspective, 29 of our projects had a Fish and Wildlife Service partner on them. So it can be categorized by agency partners as well, or by solution implementation action type. And so I wish we had a lot of the representatives on this call. We have Shiloh and Alexa, who will, that each speaker is going to ground their work in like the place that they work and the people who've made it possible. I think it's a really important and special part of these conversations is understanding the complexity and the importance of local place-based details and values. Yeah, we'll have an overview from all of them. They'll introduce their work, and then we have some panel questions. We're going to kind of just relax into a panel discussion, and then an audience Q&A after that. So Shiloh, if you're ready, I'll stop sharing my screen and you can switch to yours.
Sounds good. Okay, that look good?
Does.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
It's very pretty.
That's good. That's important. So yeah, this shows where we work. So I am the director of programs with Cascade Forest Conservancy. Our work is focused on the southern Washington Cascades. And for some place names, we got Mount Adams here, Mount St. Helens, Mount Rainier, and the Columbia River Gorge. And although we don't really work in the urban environment, I've put Portland on here so you get an idea of where we are at. The inset map kind of covers up Seattle right there. So this area largely encompasses the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, but also includes state lands, private timberlands, and areas managed by tribes. And as noted here, our work is very partnership focused. So we work with the U.S. Forest Service, the Washington Department of Natural Resources, various tribes in the region, conservation districts, nonprofits, and even timber companies. So we work on a number of projects in the climate adaptation sphere, including beaver relocation and riparian planting project that was supported by WCS and the Climate Adaptation Fund a few years ago. So this project was carried out in partnership with the Cowlitz tribe with a little bit of involvement from the Forest Service. And these photos highlight some of the steps involved in a project like this, includes spatial work to refine location specifics, on-the-ground surveys, mainly for pre-release kind of baseline data, and eventually beaver introduction and/or planting. The planting work that we mostly focus on with this project or others is focusing on disturbed areas or areas lacking biodiversity. So this project also included and still does, a landowner education component to identify opportunities for beavers to stay on the landscape, stay in place, rather than be relocated, which is often the most ideal option for this type of project. And then I'm just going to do a quick overview of other work that was designed, at least in part, with climate resilience and adaptation in mind. And I think that might help create a stronger backdrop for the conversation, or at least what we are going to add to it. So we participate in collaborative project preparing forests for prescribed fire, basically clearing small trees and duff layers so that a controlled burn remains low to the ground. The overall objective for this work is to create a more open understory and help ensure that future fires have a lower tree mortality. So this project was a partnership with the U.S. Forest Service and a forest management nonprofit called Mount Adams Resource Stewards, who took care of any work associated with chainsaws or machinery. Our work, like much of our work, is focused on community engagement and bringing volunteers out to participate in the project. Also, similarly, we focused a lot on data collection so that we had baseline information to look at how not only the prescribed fire, the success of that, but also just how these areas survive, or we see mortality in wildfires because they are common in this area. Okay, so we also carry out in-stream restoration, bringing back complexity to aquatic systems. And so this can be anything. So generally it fits under a purview of low-tech in-stream restoration or low-tech process-based restoration, anything from strategically felled riparian trees felled into the water to create fish habitat, imported logs, or things like beaver dam analogs that we see on the right of the screen, kind of that cascading photo. As you may expect, this offers a number of climate benefits. It keeps water in the system longer into the dry season, creates habitat or refugia for fish, amphibians, others, and spreads water laterally through the landscape. And in partnership with Forest Service botanists, we are working to restore certain post-fire areas that have been impacted by successive fires. So in our zone, it's really only happened on about one 800-acre area on the south side of Mount Adams that has been impacted by 3 fires over a 10-year period. And lastly, we work in coordination with the Forest Service and with Washington DNR on forest management planning. This can entail dialogue regarding suitable areas for treatment. We recently completed a 2nd edition of our climate resilience guidebook for the region, which identifies risks and outlines strategies to build resilience in both forests and aquatic habitats. And on the right, this map highlights a proposed new designation just as a kind of a snapshot example of some of the things that are in there and some of the things that we work on. So this proposed designation is like wilderness, but called a climate resilience and mitigation area. And it would be enacted through special area designation, and which would then set guidance for future management. And that's it. That's a short and sweet overview of things we are doing associated with this work.
No, it's perfect. While Alexa's getting hers up, I want to just add a comment that you know, what Shiloh didn't share is something that's unique, I think, to the Climate Adaptation Fund grant partners is like, it's already hard to do this conservation work on the ground. It's already hard to improve your systems. What they did is redid how and why they do everything to respond to the way climate change is affecting the realities in the ground, the goals that are achievable, the functions in the ecosystem. That's a similar connection to Alexa's work as being a member of that portfolio of projects. And then just to link it to the Climate Smart Communities Initiative, like that's what we're going to be trying to do at community levels, is leverage what's there, but then add and fill in gaps to help them redo how they manage their communities in light of the climate changes that they're experiencing. But yeah, I just wanted to give you props, Shiloh, because you guys redid the way you do things, and you have quite a high capacity set of network partners there with the guidebooks and the maps that you have. It's been a long evolution over at least the 12 years that the Climate Adaptation Fund has been running to see regions and partnership networks that are as high capacity and ready as you all are. Sorry, go ahead, Alexa. But that was great, Shiloh. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
No worries. Thank you very much, Liz. And thank you everyone for being here. I wish I could get to know each of you. But my name is Alexa Whipple. I am the director of the Methow Beaver Project, which is a program of Methow Salmon Recovery Foundation. We began in 2008 as a partnership between the U.S. Forest Service, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and a local land trust. And from there, we have grown into an organization that covers watershed restoration in general, social education and outreach, and many other things, as I'll show you in my slides. But I wanted to give you a little bit background what it takes to, really become a leader of conservation action that is socially focused, because that is what takes change amongst our human environment and our built environment, to incorporate nature into those built environments, because we've done a really good job at incorporating built environments into nature, and we need to start bringing back that reciprocity of bringing nature back as a priority in our environment. So I'm a wildlife biologist by training. I'm also an agricultural consultant, focused on sustainable ag systems and sustainable range management. That's a really important factor in Western United States, is grazing across our public lands. And I'm a restoration ecologist inspired by wildfire impacts across the Western United States, focus on beaver-mediated recovery from wildfire, as well as resilience, and then socio-ecological management in the restoration sphere. But I'm also a human, like everyone else listening here, and I really need fresh water to survive, and so do all the things I care about. We all do. So that really inspires my work and brings me back to focus every time I start to slip as to what the priorities really are, is we all need access to fresh water. And that includes all the biodiversity that we are so fortunate to exist with. So our mission at the Methow Beaver Project is primarily coexistence with nature, specifically beavers. Beavers represent an amazing capacity to support biodiversity, natural processes like Shiloh mentioned, process-based restoration, but process coexistence is really a key factor that we prioritize. So coexistence can mean very simple things of wrapping trees when it comes to beaver impacts, or it can mean controlling surface water elevation, or keeping culverts from being plugged up and roads flooding or failing. We can help control floodwaters, as well as keep water storage high, or natural slowing and spreading of water. So that's a very high priority for us. Translocation is an absolutely essential part of what Methow Beaver Project does when we are working and partnering with beavers, because we can't coexist with beavers everywhere in our highly modified and simplified watersheds with a lot of human infrastructure. So translocation to places on partner lands, especially U.S. Forest Service, Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Natural Resources, Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation lands. We partner with all of these agencies to relocate beavers to places that don't have as dense of human infrastructure. Watershed restoration, we're really focused on process-based restoration, but we also look at engaging in incorporating natural process into the built environment. And it is very possible. There are new strategies being developed all the time, but we have some very tried and true ones as well. But what it primarily takes is education and outreach to help people reconnect and re-understand that ecological process that we depend on, which is watershed function. That's the primary focus, is watershed function. And the more we share with people, the more they truly kind of remember, in an old way, of like, oh yeah, water, it's such an essential part of my life. How do we keep more of it around? How do we manage when there is too much of it for our built environment? And just helping people understand the role of beavers in particular in our watersheds is one of our first and foremost priorities, but training people to also manage beavers, whether that's through applying and installing coexistence projects or learning to relocate beavers or just learning how to study and monitor restoration project sites for their success and efficacy. That's been a huge bonus from partnering with the Climate Adaptation Fund, is the prioritization of monitoring and sharing that knowledge. That's been a huge benefit to increasing our outreach to our practitioners, our peers. And then modernizing beaver management. This is one that's left off the books a lot as to how do we manage a species that was nearly extirpated for fur and then has been persecuted as a nuisance species pretty much ever since. There's been pockets of relocation and prioritization of beavers as an ecological benefit and climate resilience benefit. That's increasing, it's on the rise, but it has not been the norm until the last 5 to 10 years. So yeah, we're doing a lot to change Washington's policy, but also national beaver policy, working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to create a coexistence fund that would be available through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Partners. We work with the National Fish Hatchery through U.S. Fish and Wildlife to support our relocation programs. And Beaver Corps, an important coexistence training program with beavers. And then the inclusion of tribal perspectives has to be a part of our beaver management overall. There's so much to be gained by looking to the tribes for how they prioritize and value beavers on the riverscape and watersheds. So there's a lot to do in modernizing our beaver management. So that's an important part of the work that the Climate Adaptation Fund has supported and many other partners. And this is just a small smattering of the partners that we engage with regularly. I don't even have our academic partners on here because we do focus a lot on research and pushing the needle or the edge of the envelope into what beavers can do, what we can do in partnership with beavers, and how to incorporate that into our built environments. So yeah, happy to engage in this on a national scale as beavers become really a national priority for watershed resilience and restoration. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Alexa. It's nice, I think, for us to start with where you all work and the kind of work you all do before we hit you up with our questions. And next, I'd love for Ned, I'm going to share a slide in the background about the Climate Smart Communities Initiative, if you'd like. I would love to hear from you, Ned, and the exciting times. This is year 1 of a brand new initiative to institutionalize some of this work that Shiloh and Alexa are talking about, but from more of a human community perspective, that it's inclusive of natural systems as well as nature-based solutions.
Indeed, it's very exciting, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak. And I should say right off the bat, of all the partners here, I'm a program manager and I do collaborate with the team, but this is a very talented, diverse team of adaptation practitioners who've been in climate adaptation from many perspectives, including nature-based solutions, ecological restoration, but there's a lot of expertise on this team in working in human systems, in the built environment, and with social systems. So why am I here talking? It's because at NOAA, we've been investing for the last 15 years in building a platform called the Climate Resilience Toolkit, toolkit.climate.gov, which brings together planning resources to help people do adaptation in practice. And what we found that we have to build is that we have to build a community of practice. On the slides that Alexa showed, the emphasis on engagement, communication, working with people couldn't be more relevant or essential to climate adaptation. And what we have found is that by bringing together adaptation practitioners and crowdsourcing their best ideas about how to practically apply what we know about climate resilience and climate science, we were able to surface critical investments that we worked with Climate Resilience Fund over several years prior to the launch of CSCI to invest in and give back to the community. And you can learn more about the resilience ecosystem work on the toolkit website. But we know that there's a diverse community practice emerging to support climate adaptation. And this project in particular, actually, Liz, I was hoping to show the website for Climate Smart Communities Initiative if we can, but I'll send you a link in case you get a chance to post it. It's the Climate Smart Communities Initiative has several different pillars, and it involves directly going into communities and supporting the projects that people are wanting to implement from climate resilience plans. We know that there's a gap between developing a vulnerability and risk assessment and then what do you do? CSCI is going to address that problem by bringing grants directly into communities and co-producing knowledge as well as expertise so that there's on the ground expertise. I said expertise, I meant capacity in place long-term to do the implementation work. The pillars include direct funding through grants, but training, cohort support, and monitoring, evaluation, and implementation efforts so that we can know that we are adapting, which is a huge gap in climate resilience efforts nationally. And those of you who worked on the National Climate Resilience Framework know and appreciate that. We are just launching, and we have now online capacity to bring people into doing training and being registered to be adaptation practitioners. I will leave my comments at that for now so that we can get to the Q&A, Liz.
Yeah, I'll add, Ned, your addition. Oh, we're already close to time. Sarah Mason, I have a question for you. Should we just continue with a few of our panel questions, and those who are in the audience can stay on if they'd like?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, we'll do that. Will anyone who would stay on, we have some panel questions to ask to get the advice and insight of these speakers about what it takes to actually implement something that's like a national directive or guidance, like the framework, in a way that it applies and could be effective to them as they do their place-based work, because they are the other pieces of this puzzle that are referenced in the framework. But Ned, I wanted to say something that Laura Hansen, who's the director of EcoAdapt, one of our CSCI partners, said that it hurts so bad, but we need to hear it so badly, is that we can't keep practicing faith-based adaptation. And Alexa and Shiloh are going to totally agree. We can't just like hope that it is working, that we have to be more serious and rigorous about the monitoring, sharing what works. And there is a really amazing MEI, monitoring and evaluation and innovation component of the CSCI. Okay, so for those who are staying on, we have a few questions for our panel. Let me see. Got to get to my questions here. All right, so the first one is about this parallel we want to draw between the natural resources management sector and the overall built human sector when it comes to resilience and adaptation work. So this is for all panelists. The climate adapted conservation community of practice, it's been developing for well over a decade. And the broader multi-sector national resilience movement is for sure growing fast. We can see proof of that in the news every day. Are there parallels or insights from the natural resources management sector that can be drawn to aid in the development and increase the effectiveness of this broader resilience community of practice now that we find ourselves in this place where we have something like a guiding vision in the National Climate Resilience Framework? The shorter version is, what can we translate from the natural systems in terms of partnerships and all the coordination that has to happen and the complexity that we need to grapple with now? Alexa.
In the resource and conservation world, we've been managing multiple species with human environments for a very long time, trying to, and usually priority species come to the top: endangered salmon, spotted owl, the most controversial ones in our history. But we've also been really successful at bringing species back from the brink as collaborative, coordinated efforts between social priorities and ecological priorities. So I think it's been it's a very familiar foundation of collaboration and coordination to do this. So it does feel very appropriate to take from the conservation community.
Yeah, thanks. I just like the emphasis on social and ecological priorities coming together in those historical examples. Shiloh or Ned, feel free to jump in if you'd like.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on that. Well, so first, and you kind of touched on this related to monitoring, is that, and just overall, the kind of the scientific background for a lot of these things is like, this is changing quickly. Like, so new research regarding best practices for climate adaptation can fairly quickly, redirect a course of action. And so I think it's important that funding programs or long-term projects have built-in flexibility to shift and not be stuck on a path if new things come to light. And then the other thing that comes to mind is just the value of more interagency coordination. So we've seen it here locally in Southwest Washington as it relates to prescribed fire. So there's often forest management plans that are written with prescribed fire as part of the plan, but due to limited burn windows, cautions about air quality concerns, understandable concerns, and just the overburdened nature of the Forest Service, a lot of times that just doesn't happen. And so as we're trying to build resilient landscapes, that's a key piece, and it's written into the plan, but it oftentimes doesn't get carried out. And so if you have better coordination, whether that's cities, counties, definitely state and federal and EPA systems, those kinds of things can be eased a bit. I think that would be really valuable, this type of thing.
Yeah, I think it's helpful for you to bring the specificity of like burn windows as an example of why and how that coordination really is so critical. Ned, do you want to add anything?
I'll add a couple quick thoughts. I was recently at a dissertation defense on climate policy and sea level rise. And I was really pleasantly amused and surprised to hear the phrase punctuated equilibrium come up for policy. So I know that from evolutionary biology. And I think that, so the idea is that species undergo rapid change in brief windows, and that leads to radiation and speciation events that permeate through time. So that idea of punctuated equilibrium in evolutionary biology is now in policy, but also I think in the thought process baked into how we are, in fact, borrowing from the conservation community to advance the climate conversation. 24 years ago, my program at the American Museum of Natural History funded a genetic algorithm on ecological niche modeling study of reptiles in Madagascar and looking at climate change impacts on endemic species in montane tropical environments. That was cutting edge back then. Now it's pretty much widespread in management of landscapes, in understanding assisted migration of plants. And it's certainly related to the beaver story that we're focusing on here. I think the idea of complex human natural systems comes from conservation, comes from ecological research. And now, an understanding of working lands and biodiversity as joint priorities is part of climate adaptation planning. It's in the North Carolina Climate Adaptation Plan that I helped write. I think the idea of equity is very intrinsically important to the conservation movement because, as we all know, some of the early conservation efforts were very insensitive to Indigenous people. And so we had to learn how to work with Indigenous people over the past several centuries in land protection. And because of that history, we've got a more mature conversation happening today. I think that the climate adaptation community of practice is demanding a systemic and whole of society approach to what we're doing. So in addition to those things I mentioned, governance is being re-examined. So as Shiloh mentions, coordination, actually, how do you do it? How do you bring a local perspective into governance and actually using resources? How do you bring finance to the table? Leverage public and private partnerships. So Liz and my working relationship orients around philanthropy and government and mixing these funds to do adaptation work. It's essential. I think the idea of co-production of knowledge, my experience of that and valuing lived experience of people has been grounded in the climate science, social science community. And so I think that we are now seeing how these different complex systems approaches to science and conservation really do, in fact, merge in important and significant ways.
I love that. Yeah, I see Alexa has some thoughts, but yeah, I love you bringing up like the importance of equity and governance being reexamined. And as you're talking, Ned, about the complex adaptive systems, I think about the concept of multi-solving and how really in the conservation world and this world of the Climate Smart Communities Initiative is inserting itself to make an impact or help others who are already driving just join the ride in making that impact. It really is multi-solving for a lot of past hurts and injustices, but also a lot of other issues that climate change is impacting. But that's where my thoughts went when you were talking, Ned. And I hadn't thought about the multi-solving for a while.
Vanilla Meadows, yeah, good
yes,
reference.
Yes. Alexa, what were you gonna add?
Well, I wanted to build on something that Ned said that wasn't stated as clearly as I wanted to make sure people heard, was the creativity and the potential that is so necessary to push ourselves into the uncomfortable area of living with complexity. Yes. And that approaching things with that creative beginner's mind or creative mind, but to also look at things as an experiment that aren't the end, it's the beginning. And if it's not working in one iteration, you try another iteration. And that to me is how we take human built environments on top of an ecological process-based system and help bring the ecological process back into it without losing or saying we can't have both. It's how do we do it? We haven't had to do both very much, at least not in our modern thinking of how to work with water. Like in India and Iran, other dry places, they've been working with water and the natural processes of water for a long time, but we've lost so much of that information, that indigenous knowledge, that way to live with nature that doesn't say humans can't be part of it. It is, we're part of it, but so are the animals, so is the wildlife, so is the water. How do we do it better? Let's try to do it better.
Yeah. I before I get to the next question, I love what you're all bringing up, because the creativity in the beginner's mind is really essential. I've noticed over the work with the Climate Adaptation Fund, and now with the work in communities, in human communities facing questions of retreat, historical injustices, totally new normals that are destroying their roads or their plumbing systems. I'm not saying it's easy, but what you were saying about it's not the end, it's the beginning is a helpful frame, because there is a lot of emotion in adaptation and resilience. And I found that in the conservation side first before I came to, of course, it's more maybe easier and more obvious to see it in the human community world. But letting go of the old normal and the predictability and the certainty is actually emotionally and sometimes psychologically difficult. And as practitioners and leaders, I think it is really important to recognize that and have some of that baked into the process. And thinking back to Shiloh's comment about baking in agility and flexibility, expecting to have to shift and pivot helps with that emotional component that can be, I think, a roadblock. So the next question for all panelists is, so in your adaptation work, what types of cross-sector partnerships have been or are the most effective at addressing climate change challenges through on-the-ground action? And why? Why were they why did they work well? Why do they help you get far or get somewhere?
I'll jump in if you'd like. And
thanks, man.
turn the floor back over to everybody, but I'd like to rewind a little bit from the direct focus on climate adaptation and just say that I've been in climate science communication for 25 years. And so in order to do that, you have to be interdisciplinary. You have to be transdisciplinary. There's no way to understand something like the Earth system and convey something meaningful to someone else without consulting people who have expertise in different domains. That sounds really obvious, but it was really important to me to be able to literally take the scientific data analysis code from scientists in different disciplines and turn those into visualizations that I could use to explain to people what's going on in the climate system, how it works, how show people biodiversity loss using satellite imagery, and show the connection of these issues to our economy and our lifestyle. So one of the highlights of the work that I did in science communication before coming to NOAA was doing a museum program about Valley Oaks in San Francisco and having indigenous people stand up and say, this is what museums should do. Establish connection for people with their landscape, help them reconnect with their history of their landscape in order to understand who we are as people and adapt and live and be in relationship with climate. That's a way I like to think about it, Alexa. We are part of the natural system and we are in relationship to it, and we will be even as it continues to change. So that's very important basic idea, and it does require openness to many disciplines. So education and training has become a bigger part of my job as I focus on workforce development personally. And this is a big part of the Climate Smart Communities Initiative, is supporting adaptation practitioners who have to understand so many different domains. They have to understand governance, social systems, GIS. What is emergency management? How do you apply this information to transportation? And it goes on and on and on. So in my office, because we have capacity for climate education, we're being asked by all the different departments in the federal government to provide training in workforce development. And I know this is an essential idea in the National Climate Resilience Framework, is building the workforce.
Yeah.
So a great example of doing that on the ground is the emergency management community of practice. Those folks have really leaned into working with NOAA, and they have funding, they have mandates, they have processes for engaging community members and assessing readiness and so forth. So CSCI is inheriting a lot of thinking about how to build locally grounded partnerships. By working, though, from the bottom up, I think that's really what's unique with our project, because we are putting that capacity to provide the coordination that really Shiloh emphasized, that need to coordinate across levels of across agencies. But the local perspective is what's really essential to understand what is needed. If you're translocating a beaver, you have to know exactly what's going to happen and why you're moving them and why you're moving, where you're moving them. The same is true with people moving out of harm's way or being prepared for disasters or making better decisions about community resilience. So we're the training and support that we're providing to our cohort of adaptation practitioners is meant to bring people along the steps to resilience, but from a bottom-up perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Ned. I think it's interesting that the model of CSCI is expecting the local leaders to be in the driver's seat. It's set up expecting that there'll be a driver there. I'd love to ask Shiloh too about the partnerships. The driver comment I just made reminded me of some things that you have noticed in your work, Shiloh, with who those people are when they get together and they actually move. Who are they?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, Ned. I was thinking the exact same thing. So we've found the most success working at the hyper local level with the Forest Service, with the federal agency, in that Like for instance, if we're working on post-fire revegetation, for instance, we're working with a botanist and other ologists, other specialists at that level. And that's how work has moved forward in everything we've done with the Forest Service over the years. And they take it up the chain. And so just developing those relationships at the local on the ground level is just exactly where we found success. And all different types of fields with the Forest Service. So I'm glad that you mentioned that and are recognizing the same pattern.
Yeah. Alexa.
I would
Thanks.
agree that you only get things done when you're working with the local people and you have their support and you have a collaborative partnership that's meeting their priorities that are usually written out in their strategic plans or forest plans or WDFW's wildlife management plans that you can specifically address with the work you're doing, whether that's through restoration or through coexistence services or education and outreach. I think that's where we have the best cross-sector partnerships is when we have federal, state, and state agencies at a local level working with local community engagement. And so your community is saying, I now understand why you're doing this. Why do we need to have prescribed fire? Why do we need to learn to live with beavers better? Why does it matter to have beavers in our big rivers and not just ship them off into the headwaters without any beavers or good habitat in between? The education and understanding of it helps build the support that then gives our local agency representatives the freedom to do that work without persecution on a local level. You know, it's circular. You can't have it just with one person, one agency. It's got to be complete, or not complete, you'll never get complete, but a large community support network as well. So that's where I'd like to see like the biggest landowners and then the most people in your community as private landowners or private citizens in your community all working in the same direction.
Yeah. When I hear like biggest landowners, I hear like the champion. I hear like when that person who owns the most acres makes the move to change the way they manage their land, the other smaller landowners tend to follow.
Or vice versa. Yeah. Some of our smallest landowners are the ones that are bravest and
no way.
most forward thinking. And then you look to them as being the poster representative of that new method or strategy or direction. And you bring your federal agency and your state agency folks, local ones, and then they bring it up the chain. Like Shiloh said, if they see it and say, oh my gosh, this is working, I can't wait to bring my supervisor out here. Oh, I can't wait to bring them out here. So it can go both ways, Liz, but both are needed.
Yeah.
Absolutely needed.
Yeah, maybe that's the point. Yeah, and I think I noticed a lot that came up that would be one of the answers to this question at the National Adaptation Forum across a few sessions, that an important part of a partnership is someone who can translate. Someone who has those internal connections and relationships that you're talking about, Alexa, but who can translate what the national directives are, because and having people who actually own the relationships that you need, anyone who you need to do the work, you can't just come in and start working with them unless you already have that relationship. You need to work through someone else who you know, but is a relationship owner or part of that local network. I think we'll go for our last question, which I think is a good one for everybody. So are there, again, from your perspective and your adaptation work, thinking about implementation on the ground, are there critical gaps or needs that you have that are preventing you from doing either more of your work or preventing you from doing it more effectively that could be addressed in how agencies implement the National Resilience Framework? Does this framework bring opportunities to fill any of those gaps or meet a need?
I have some note for that.
Yeah, go ahead, Shiloh.
Well, so for federal and state agencies in particular that have a certain scope of programmatic work, so in the instance of the Forest Service here in Southwest Washington, that might be timber management. And for work to move forward outside of that scope of work, it can be sometimes quite difficult because they have a lot to do. They're focused on getting those things moving forward. And so some sort of entity like a partnership liaison that specifically focused on not only establishing partnerships, but helping ease approvals, permitting, check boxes, whatever is needed, and the local input as well, of course, as we mentioned, but just ensuring that that happens and helping to tell all levels of the agency, hey, this is important. We want to move this forward, because in many cases there isn't a person or a role or even a group that can do that. So
Yeah,
yeah, I think
great
that would
point.
make a huge difference.
I want to build on what Shiloh said there. I think one of the most critical things in our state right now in Washington is that local leadership really drives implementation in a lot of our state regulations and permitting processes, and that isn't standardized across the state. And there are reasons for that are science-based in some places, and others that are personality-based or experience-based in the leadership role. And those are really hard walls to get over or past when there is just a personality in that as a barrier, not science, not efficacy, but a personality. So I think that's where a liaison like Shiloh's talking about that could be approaching it, that's valued at the state agency scale, but also trusted at the local scale, to help move these innovative strategies forward. I mean, they're not unproven. They are innovative and new, but not unproven.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the part that we really need help in accelerating these strategies and the impacts that we're looking for.
Love that. Thanks.
Interesting. Could I share my screen, Liz?
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to answer your question, but also address a question that came up in the Q&A panel in Zoom here. And right now I'm vamping so that I can find the window I want to share. I found it. So the question that someone asked dealt with how do we know that the adaptation actions we're doing are actually going to keep up with the kinds of impacts we're facing. And so in CSCI, we're looking at not just the climate risk, but also the non-climate stressors that are affecting communities. So, and redressing past inequity. But we're doing that essentially through these local partnerships that we've been talking about for the last several minutes. Also overcoming the implementation gap, which we know, so over here on the left, that people are learning how to evaluate their exposure, vulnerability, and risk. But when it comes to what to do about it, these are the tools we're building in CSCI, is the capacity. Now, Alexa mentioned that in her community practice, they know what works. The fact is, the reason we're coming up with things like the National Climate Resilience Framework and the National Climate Assessment keeps citing problems over and over is that we haven't yet proven exactly what to do, and we need to document. So that idea of monitoring and evaluation that, Liz, you emphasized earlier is an essential part of CSCI. I thought I'd just take a moment or two to emphasize some of the key messages from the National Climate Assessment. You can read these on your own. I'm going to put them on screen. Now let's look at so it's 3 of these deal with equity, essentially, and our social systems. And let's compare this policy document, the National Climate Resilience Framework. So I did a quick little evaluation of, well, how do these line up? And it struck me that when you put them side by side, some of the National Climate Resilience Framework objectives line up pretty well with the key messages in the National Climate Assessment. And we don't have time to go through all of this, actually. We can provide this as a handout.
Nice mapping.
But there were a few objectives that, to me, felt under reported in the adaptation chapter of the assessment. So integration, we've talked about the need to work across departments in the federal government and so forth. So integration into planning and management across agencies, across different people's domains, and understanding climate across different sectors is essential to our workforce development. Working with the built environment as well as managing lands and waters. Those get treated in other chapters of the assessment, but when it comes to adaptation, I think Alexa said it very well when she said, we've got to think of the built environment as part of the natural system. It's not separable, actually. And we've got to understand the relations between the two. So the take-home point here is that we know climate risk is changing, accelerating, increasing through time. And we know that local resilience and adaptation efforts are happening, but we need a spark right now, and that's CSCI, so that we can catch up with the adaptation efforts that are needed in order to catch up with the risk we face. And that's the message I want to leave you with, that we're aspiring to in CSCI.
I want to build on what Ned said, is the way we can catch up, and it doesn't have to be forever this way, is to support communities, individuals, communities, agencies in moving forward with what feels like risky endeavors to apply these strategies on larger scales and accelerate application. There's got to be funding that does support this and makes it incentive-based, not stick-based or punishment. And then looking at that social issue of getting more comfortable with the complexity of living with nature and depending on it again in a way that builds so much sustainability into our systems, and that comfort with complexity has to be supported through that funding. So I guess it's kind of circular of like, how do you make new things happen? You make it free or easily accessible, and you make it easy to do the right thing. You make it hard to do the wrong thing anymore. And you try to move forward as quickly as possible. And the best way to get people on board is help them give it a shot without a lot of cost to them, and hopefully see the benefits very quickly over time. And they help spread the word to their neighbors. The more it becomes a community of engagement, the more likely we are to succeed in living perpetually with nature. And that's the other part of it, is we can't just say, beavers, it's up to you. Thanks for trying. We're counting on you. It's us committing to living with them. And that's just an example of beavers, but living with fresh water, living with mosquitoes, living with some things that we are so used to living without as comfort and convenience. Some of those are absolutely essential for our future and every other living species' future. We've got to figure out how to live with them and try to do it as happily, because I think we can. I think we can address all of these things. It's just the willingness and the vision to engage.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a mindset and an attitude, flexibility, willingness to risk,
but
deal
support
with uncertainty.
and support.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you, everybody. We're actually now at time. I had mistakenly read my phone the wrong way when I caught myself off guard that we were at time. So I hope I didn't scare too many people off the webinar. But to Sarah Mason and the Resilience Roadmap Project, thank you for having us. But I also just thank you for all the outreach you've been doing with the framework and trying to inform federal action to include and prioritize adaptation alongside mitigation. I've definitely noticed since the framework came out from my side of this world, that I see you all out there coming to places where I am at and colleagues of mine are at. I see you are not just staying in like maybe the same kind of meeting halls or venues that are per usual. You're getting out to practitioners, bringing practitioners to you. And I hope you have more of these conversations. I have a strong bias towards them, but I think that these kinds of exchanges are really excellent for what we're trying to do, like as a nation, while being place-based and locally focused and equity focused. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Liz. Good to hear we're reaching somebody. So
yeah,
we can keep having these conversations. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you both. And thank you everyone else on the call.
Sarah, anything else that we should mention to your viewers in the series?
No,
All right.
that's good.
Thanks, Shiloh, Alexa, and Ned for being panelists and sharing your advice and insight.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for your time.